Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Kyle.
I'm Nina.
I'm Hayley.
I'm Beth.
And before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. I have successfully separated the actual plays from our talk podcast.
Hooray!
The crowd goes wild.
So it is now separated both on Stitcher and iTunes. You can find our actual plays in their own feed. The Apocalyptia actual play that we did, the 8 sessions of it, it's actually in both feeds right now because it would have required too much in order for me to separate it out from what had already been published, so I just went ahead and republished it. But other than that, our new actual plays will be coming out pretty much on Wednesdays from now on, as long as we have them to publish.
Which brings up our topic for today, the band Till Tuesday. Why not Till Wednesday? Because then they could have enjoyed the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. That's not our topic for today. That was a joke.
Is it a joke if you have to say that was a joke afterwards?
Now I'm going to have to go and add a laugh track. Our topic today is how to define your sci-fi setting.
I was close.
And I want to start off by giving probably the best bad example of how to define a sci-fi setting that I have seen in popular media. And this comes from the movie Thank You for Smoking with Aaron Eckhart. There is a scene where Aaron Eckhart's main character and is meeting with a movie executive played by Rob Lowe, and they are... Rob Lowe is trying to pitch to have cigarettes as a sponsor for this movie, and it's a sci-fi movie set on a space station. And Aaron Eckhart's character says, but wouldn't a cigarette explode in a pure oxygen environment? And to which Rob Lowe's character says, oh, we'll just throw in a line about, isn't it a good thing that we have the something things that take care of all that? That is the quintessential example of bad sci-fi, in my opinion, because that means there is no forethought into what is going into the sci-fi. It's all afterthought, like just fixing problems as they come up. I feel like with a good sci-fi, you should think about how these things are going to impact your story before you even present them to the players.
That's something I've heard a lot when people are doing like steampunk, something punk kind of stuff. It's not just add-ons, I want to make it look steampunk, add some gears on this gun, make sure there's a reason for them to work. And I think that helps a lot when looking at a story element. So you have to, the way I would look at it would be kind of like putting together a machine. If I'm going to add a cog in, I need to connect it to the other ones to make sure it's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a big complaint of mine with a lot of steampunk is that people's response to world creation seems to be, just throw some gears on it! More gears!
Yeah.
It doesn't make any damn sense.
And goggles.
And goggles.
Oh, yeah, gears and goggles. Mine eyes, the goggles do nothing! The gears and goggles, throw them on there like you had a Zeppelin cruising around and there's fucking gears spinning on the outside of... the main body of the Zeppelin, and the Zeppelin has goggles for some reason on front of it. That's bad. Don't do that.
Or your goggles have goggles.
Like little multiple flip-down lenses.
But also, can you just, like a Dungeons & Dragons, but steampunk is just called Gears and Goggles? Because I love it.
It should exist. My biggest problem with the pure oxygen environment example is that space is no longer a pure oxygen environment. Well, spacecraft. We have the brave men of Apollo 1 to mourn for that. Yeah, so I mean, I think the biggest issue with cigarettes in space is that it would overload the, scrubbers. I mean, you could have, maybe a little smoking room that has, a specific kind of scrubber or a vent to space, but really they just should have done their due diligence, and ultimately... I'm bringing it back. That's what sci-fi is all about. Doing your due diligence. When you create something and you want your readers or viewers, whatever, to believe I can't say that. I was going to say believe the fantasy, but like lowercase f fantasy, you know? If you want them to suspend their disbelief about things, you have to at least give them some things to chew on so that they, like, I'm not saying you can't do sci-fi and have something like FTL. I know that our opinions differ, Clayton. I think that yours is just way too hardline. You can have faster than light travel as long as you have some kind of an explanation for what it is, and definitely explain how that affects every other element of life. Because that's also what's great about sci-fi, is having one thing that changes just the way everyone lives, and you go into detail about how their lives are changed by this invention, even if the invention itself isn't totally scientifically correct or explained. Debate me.
Well, I completely agree that you have to understand how things work. And this is regardless of your genre. But it is of critical importance in sci-fi because most people's definition of sci-fi is something along the lines of, I try to look up several different definitions of sci-fi to get something that we could all agree on. I actually have several quotes of... So, science fiction is a form of popular entertainment which contains elements of known, extrapolation of known, or logical theoretical science. That is the earliest definition of sci-fi that I could find from 1926.
1926?
Yep.
Wow, that's actually really good.
That is good.
I like that. What's everyone's view on Frankenstein? Frankenstein being the first piece of science fiction?
I love it. It's great. Mary Shelley's my god.
But is it sci-fi?
Is it sci-fi or is it horror?
Why not both?
Well, like, yeah, I know it can be both, but like...
¿Por qué no los dos?
Yeah, okay.
Well, here's the thing. The horror of Frankenstein is...
That's what it's called.
the horror of it is the horror of humanity. And it's, honestly, I don't see it as the way a sense of horror like blood, guts, gore, and how the modern day viewer would contextualize horror. It's the horror of the mind. It's the horror of humanity. This monster who all they want to do is find compassion and humanity, and that everything they do just doesn't.
Oh, well, I wasn't arguing that it wasn't horror. I was arguing it wasn't sci-fi.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Bringing a dead body back to life, and Mary Shelley goes into, like, deets.
I think you maybe have to look at, like, the era something comes from whenever you're determining whether it's sci-fi. Because, like, to us now... with what we know, bringing dead bodies back to life seems ridiculous, and like that definitely belongs in the horror/fantasy category. But to people back in that era where there were so many like just vast sea changes in science going on, like I feel like it might have looked realistic to somebody back then to say that maybe here in a few years we will be reanimating dead bodies.
I mean, we can already shock a dead corpse with electricity and cause its parts to move.
Right.
Point of history, that's exactly when we started doing that, is like right before Frankenstein was written.
Mm-hmm.
I think my argument that it's not science fiction is that the in-story explanation for why this is happening isn't science, it's alchemy. He's a student of alchemy, and Victor Frankenstein doesn't even call it science. He calls it an alchemic reaction and stuff like that. So, like,
is alchemy technically a science?
No, because even at the time period, they didn't consider it a science. So that is my argument. No.
Well,
no, and if we're looking at like context, even when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, they didn't consider alchemy science. They considered it outdated and stupid, to be quite honest.
Can an author write something and consider it when they write it to be one genre, but have society label it another genre?
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
Oh, kind of like bad movies.
It's like the example I gave of somebody not really understanding the stuff that they're putting in the story or the setting. You run into this all the time in movies, and also like pretty much the entire pulp genre is a very surface understanding of something and taking that surface understanding and making it sound like you know a lot more than you actually do.
That's fair. That's fair. So with that commonly accepted definition of sci-fi, so what are some of our own personal tastes when it comes to sci-fi? We have that kind of commonly accepted definition that I like quite a bit, but what about personal preferences or beliefs in some things that, especially if you like think something is sci-fi but it's really controversial? Let's talk about that.
I want to say, first off, because Clayton talking about, like, people talking about things they have a very base knowledge of and don't really know what they're talking about, the most horrible pet peeve thing is when somebody starts their concept with, humans only use 10% of their brains. Like, oh my god. I'm like, if you literally took 5 seconds to, like, research that fact, you would find out it's completely inaccurate. And it immediately turns me off of anything that I try to read, or, like, Stephen King has used it before, I pitched that book. Like, as soon as I run across that fact, I can't deal with it.
Have you seen Lucy?
Yes.
Yeah,
I have.
Love that movie.
It's terrible.
I think that somehow, we just watched it. Altered States. So somehow Altered States gets away with it. I think because it's this whole, like, Faustian, weird, fantastical journey. Whereas, I haven't seen Lucy, but I'm guessing that it tries to take itself seriously.
Oh, very seriously.
Yeah. Altered States doesn't, like, it takes itself seriously, but it butts right up against the wall of strangeness, and then just, like, pushes its way through. Weird film.
That movie's like 50% sci-fi, 50% like just religious scripture.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so weird.
On the trend of personal tastes, and I don't think anybody here at this table is going to disagree, and if you do, I'm ending our friendship. Firefly. I enjoy Firefly because it takes sci-fi in a place that I never thought I'd see it, and that's sci-fi western. And I really like the blending of it, specifically because it roots itself in the idea of, what if humans were able to go out and colonize other things? What would that be like? The akin of this outward movement, it would be kind of like how the first movement toward westwards would be, and I feel like that's how they would have started that and go, okay, well, the technology, if you're doing that, would not be as great. There'd be certain planets, and then you could, like, logic your way into how this universe runs. And I really, really appreciate the lore of this world, looking at it through that lens, and first you're like, sci-fi western, that doesn't make sense, but it makes so much sense, and I love it.
Firefly is pure pulp.
What? No.
It's pulp western with sci-fi trappings.
No.
That's not to say that it's bad.
Yeah. I have a question.
It's sci-fi.
If something is set like pretty far in the future, does it have to be sci-fi? Because I find that that's...
Unfortunately, yes, because
Yeah.
you can't set something in the future and not have a present-day item, event, belief, whatever, expounded upon and taken to the extreme.
So is this another fantasy thing where it's like one drop of a scientific thing is extrapolated on, and then suddenly it's science fiction?
No. But like, if
Because I
you
wouldn't.
can-
I don't know how much I would believe Firefly was science fiction. It's just set in the future.
What? No.
But it's set in a future where things have reached an extreme. You have the 1%, the core worlds, and actually I'm not sure if that's right in the Firefly universe, but you have quite a few people, maybe not 99% of them, living out on the rim, and they wanted freedom. They were far away from the oppressive regime and like standards and codes of the core worlds, and so they had a rebellion. And they got their butt kicked.
Space dystopia.
No. Hold on.
Firefly is kind
Science
of
fiction.
dystopian.
Reavers are science fiction.
Okay, I'll give you that. I just completely forgot about them.
I would like to point out that one thing that always annoyed me about Firefly
Oh, fist fight. Let's go.
is space is really big. Like, you might think it's a long ways to walk down the street to the chemist, but that's peanuts next to the space. Okay? And in Firefly, and in Firefly, you have a Reaver ship flying nearby, so let's all go silent. Let's turn down the engines so that as they're flying by in the vastness of space, they just happen to pass within 30 meters of us on their way to other planets.
Yeah, it's called luck and writing.
It is
No!
called
Suspension of
convenience.
disbelief only goes so far.
Yes.
I like Firefly. I really do.
I do
But
too.
on the note of the Reavers, it always bothered me that you could have these cracked out fucking CRISPR genes gone wrong, insane
Spoiler alert.
predators.
Yeah, for people who haven't seen Firefly.
We can put it spoiler alert. But
The
also
movie came out 13 years ago.
Yeah, I know, and I'd only
It's-
recently seen it 3 years ago.
That's your fault.
I'm only
it's an age
20.
thing. Yeah, I was gonna say.
I don't care. I'm not going to put spoilers for something that came out 14 years ago.
I think if people listen to a podcast about different things and they see in the show notes the topics and the books and the things we cover and they haven't read that thing yet, they should be prepared. Looking at you, listeners. Be prepared for the fact that these Reavers are just like projects of the government that have been altered for whatever reason. I won't go too far into it so you can watch it. But they're pure primal instinct crazy people. And yet they can operate the sensors and find other ships in the vast void of space. And they can operate faster-than-light travel engines and calculate out jumps using astrogation or whatever they do in the Firefly verse. And do all of these incredibly complex tasks on a spacecraft. But when you look at one, they're just like... their claws are out and, like... That doesn't make any damn sense to me.
But no, hold on. Even the craziest person can operate a spaceship. Also, I feel like the Reavers, it's not always that. Because remember, there's early on in the series, they're in the western town and they're doing a bank heist, and then the Reavers show up. And they can, like, operate things, they're targeting them, and you can, like, see them on the ships. Serenity wasn't the first time that you physically saw the Reavers.
I know.
And therefore, I feel like it's something of a matter of fact of the hunger that activates that specific drug in their system that makes it go...
But...
Bam. Theory.
They don't speak. They don't have any...
You don't need to speak to kill people.
They don't have any evidence of any sort of functioning other than primal instinct. And if your primal instinct is to roid rage out, claw someone open, and eat them... then how in the world do you have the wherewithal to plot a fucking faster-than-light jump and then operate your ship using RCS thrusters to match velocity while also having someone on the fucking sensors targeting your other ship and communicating back and forth and having any kind of chain of command necessary to operate an incredibly complex vehicle? But you're just a primal raged. The point is that in Firefly, if they would have had like some overlord Reaver that was like this brainiac that was like able to telepathically give them instructions or like put up like a calming field to suppress their primal instinct long enough for them to go beep boop and like operate the ship, then maybe that's fine. But I never saw any evidence of that.
I literally love that you're looking in sci-fi, looking for the bare minimum of like explanations for things.
That's all I need. But it has to be logical.
Yes.
A logical extrapolation, a logical, an educated guess, if you will.
Logical, theoretical science.
Yeah.
Well, I'm never sharing anything I love with y'all ever again.
We all
like Firefly.
Not everybody has to agree. It's better, I think, if not everybody agrees.
And the fact that we think it's pulp doesn't make it less good. I love pulp detective novels. I have read so many, and I feel like I could be a detective after reading these. However, if I were to get out there and try to be a detective after all the pulp I've read, I would fail miserably, because I've just read the external trappings. All I would do is, like, get in an old police cruiser, chain smoke cigarettes, and, like, have some, like, bourbon in the console, and I'd sit outside the person's apartment, and then I'd have the cops called on me, and I'm drunk and in a car, and they don't like that!
Also, I've literally, like, essentially taken a class on lesbian pulp fiction. Like, nobody here is down, I'm dragging on pulp.
Well, who else has what is up? That's all I had for the table was Firefly, and you've all debunked it.
It's not debunked.
I feel debunked, de-sci-fied.
No,
We're not saying it isn't. It doesn't have sci-fi in it. We're just saying it's not pure sci-fi.
It's like sci-fi slash
Yeah.
something.
No,
It's not hard sci-fi.
Well, no, of course not.
And not all sci-fi has to be hard. It can be soft sometimes.
Give us an example.
Of what?
A soft sci-fi.
the ugly
You
series
just gave an
by
example of
Scott
soft
Westfall.
sci-fi.
I
Why
wanna-
don't give an example of hard?
Well, since you asked, one of my favorite examples of soft sci-fi is Farscape.
Yep.
Farscape is amazing, but there's a lot of shit that they just kind of give you a logical, like, this is how it works, kinda, and then they explain to you, and this is how society is affected by this sort of strange thing that we kind of hand-waved away. It's some of the most colorful, inventive, like, wacky sci-fi I've ever seen, with Jim Henson Company puppets, and a really great romance. Farscape. It's awesome.
after shitting on Luc Besson for Lucy, I would like to throw out as
that was Luc Besson.
I would like to throw out as great soft sci-fi, The Fifth Element.
That's my favorite movie of all time. I love The Fifth Element. I recognize it's not high cinema, it's not high art, but I love The Fifth Element. Just like Farscape, it is colorful and wonderful and fantastic. And
I've never seen it. There's so many things
good.
I haven't seen.
There's a new Luc Besson movie coming out.
Valerian and the City of Thousand Planets.
It's probably going to be not a great story,
No,
but it's
okay.
going to be a spectacle. That's for damn sure.
It's
All of his movies are
beautiful.
spectacles. Even Lucy, despite what happened in it, it was a spectacle.
It was pretty to watch, I guess.
Watch all Luc Besson movies. So, I would like to say an example of good hard sci-fi. That would be The Expanse on Sci-Fi Channel. It is set a few hundred years in the future. I don't remember the exact number. But mankind has started to reach to the outer solar system. They've got colonies on asteroids. There's terraforming on Mars. And there is very little about what is happening in that series that I wouldn't look at what we currently have today and think, wow, at some point in the future, we are definitely going to have that. To me, good hard sci-fi, it may be wrong in the amount of time that it takes to get to a certain technological level, but I 100% believe that we will reach that technological level. Another example would be 2001: A Space Odyssey. I feel like Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick, they were just off by the year.
If we do not destroy ourselves, we will someday venture to the stars. I'm looking at you, humans. All of you, I see everything. I have a controversial example of hard sci-fi. It's my parents' favorite film, Avatar. James Cameron, right? James Cameron's Avatar.
What is hard sci-fi about floating rock islands?
Okay, so hear me out.
And unobtainium.
All of the human-used technology is hard sci-fi. How they get to Pandora, the equipment they use once they get there, even the stupid Jake Sully Sahelu jack into the natives technology, which might be the hardest one to explain, but I'm going to back it up. The ship they use to get to Pandora. If anybody recalls what it looks like, it's this very long vessel that has all of these shuttles, they look very similar to a space shuttle, docked on the sides of it. And it's got these massive radiator fins that extend out. And I forget exactly what kind of propulsion it's said to use, but I want to say that it's some kind of nuclear reaction. And whatever it is, it generates a fuck ton of heat. And it's not FTL. It gets up to decently fast over years, years and years and years it takes to get to Pandora. And so this thing thrusts on its way there. These radiator fins keep down this massive exothermic reaction. Then it has to actually flip over and then decelerate to not overshoot Pandora. For being such I know it's controversial, but for being such a film where you might look at me crazy for calling it hard sci-fi, it's this Hollywood blockbuster, beautiful, 3D goggles kind of film. But that ship is pretty damn accurate to what kind of ship we might someday use to reach other star systems. Also, the technology they use once they get there. Shuttles that have, they're capable of atmospheric re-entry, entry. And then they don't leave. They're these kind of drop ships that enter the atmosphere, and then that's that. They can, I think, fly around once they're in the atmosphere, but they don't have any intention of getting them back off of Pandora again. They don't have weird Star Wars type hover ships. They have helicopters and jets, things that we're going to be using in atmosphere travel for the next 100-some years, unless we invent some kind of weird alien UFO anti-gravity nonsense. Harnessing the mechanical or what the hell is it? I forget how they say UFOs fly. Magnetic energy of a magnetic field. There it is of the planet. Lol. And they're using projectile weapons. Even though we do have chemical laser technology implemented in some of our destroyers right now, and it's been tested in jumbo jet size aircraft, it's not small enough to mount in a fighter yet, and it is certainly not small enough to have a handheld laser pistol, and that's going to be quite some time. I mean, look at the 80s. People were obsessed with lasers in the 80s, obsessed with them.
These lasers are great.
They're cool. From Ronald Reagan all the way over to your average, kid on a suburban block. Everybody wanted laser weapons. But they're very hard to miniaturize. And so they are advanced, but they're still small explosion propelling a metal slug type weapons. Things I can't quite proclaim to be hard sci-fi, perhaps because I'm just not knowledgeable enough about the topic. But I could see how it might be possible. Would be the mechs, the mech suits people ride in. I'm not sure if that's ever going to be practical. And you could do it. I mean, there are mechs right now that exist. They shoot airsoft pellets. But I don't know if they're ever going to be a practical warfare solution. Exosuits, sure, traveling long distances, lifting heavy objects, but to have a war mech, I don't know. They're cool as hell. Don't get me wrong. And then, of course, lastly, the Jake Sully Sahelu plug-in, so we can, flesh clone a big blue, weird-looking Native American thing, and then get inside of it and be the white man that saves everyone. I don't know about that. I mean, we've got, the ability to snap a bunch of electrodes onto somebody, and then when you move your arm and fingers across the room, you're actually manipulating a robot arm and finger with the, electrical signals and, whatnot through your nervous system. But to clone something and then transfer your consciousness inside of it, that's going to be pretty far off, if ever. I don't know enough about it. I wish Nina were here. Yeah, Lenina, our resident science bean. That's my beliefs on Avatar. Shoot it down. Go ahead. Give it a shot.
Oh, I'm just in awe that you spent that long talking about this movie.
I've seen it a lot.
Me too. It's also my parents' favorite movie.
Oh, well. Man, something about, baby boomers and Gen Xers, they liked Avatar: The Last Airbender. Wait, what? No, not that. Oh, God. Oh, my God, he's making another one of those. He's Shyamalan. No, Shyamalan is making another Avatar: The Last Airbender movie. Yup, it's happening. But
reboot or a sequel?
Sequel. Because people love that film, so much. But yes, James Cameron is also making several more Avatar films.
I think the number now is up to 6 or something.
Oh God!
Jeez,
that's what Sigourney Weaver said.
Oh, God bless her.
So I'm not going to dispute what you just said, but I'm going to kick off of it to kind of go in a slightly different direction.
Okay.
And I never thought about Avatar that way.
You're welcome.
To be honest, I haven't watched it recently to have picked up on all that. But it sounds like in that movie, James Cameron definitely made a decision as to what was going to be speculative about the sci-fi, what was going to be the thing that went beyond what could be foreseen. And I feel like that's a very important thing to keep in mind whenever you're designing a setting or deciding to run a setting, is to decide ahead of time how far does your sci-fi extend, and are you going to put anything that is beyond what we can expect? And that goes back to just understanding how things work. If you know how you want your for example, in Star Trek, how your faster than light travel is going to work, then it allows you to go into all of what became the Treknobabble of all of the explanations as to how it works, so that in universe it all makes sense, even though we're all sitting on the outside of it and they're just saying things about warp coils and reversing the polarity on the ion junction and
tachyon beams.
Yeah,
I think that's a really great point, and I think that if you are designing a setting or a world for a campaign or for a story, it is pretty important to pick your battles. In a sense where if you look at back at Avatar for a second,
thank God.
They're using things that we can all identify with and things that are real, but then they have a couple of things that are very far-thinking, very hand-wavy ideas. The machines that allow them to transfer consciousnesses, the strangeness of Pandora with the magnetic field, floating island bullshit. And those are a couple of things that basically we can't explain. We're not going to try to explain them. But hey, viewers, you see a lot of other things that you can immediately identify with and see and not doubt for a second. So it's okay. If Avatar had kept in those two strange... I guess also the whole consciousness of the planet. There's like some weird... Like everything on the planet is like a shared consciousness or some nonsense. So except for those three things, everything else is very believable and very normal. And so if Avatar had force-wielding lightsaber-type figures and plasma cannon weapons and, like, floating hover ships and other Star Wars technology and faster-than-light travel, it's becoming a clusterfuck at this point, right? All of that stuff together, you can't relate or identify or find a root or an anchor in any of that shit. And so it becomes very unbelievable and strange. And, like, in Star Trek... There's a lot of crazy things happening in Star Trek. Space travel, weapons, phasers, shields, a lot of personal little items like the tricorder and little hyposprays that are actually, hypospray might be becoming a reality here, but things that are very far-thinking, but they have other things that are very rooted and grounded. Humans on a starship. They live in quarters. They have a bed, and in Riker's case, a trombone. And they have a shower, and they eat food, and no one consciousness hops from body to body on a regular basis. There might be an episode or two about that, but like it's not it's not a transhuman society. People are born, they live a long time because of medical advances, and they die. Yes, there's an android, but like there are definitely when you're creating a setting, there are certain things you need to. Not everything has to be a wacky extrapolation of far-thinking technology, and it really shouldn't be. Some things should be rooted in what we have today so that your audience doesn't get completely isolated.
I agree with that. I also, kind of coming off the point of, whenever you're creating everything and you're deciding which of your things are going to be more out there and extrapolated and less explained, I think you need to... you can have a point later on where it's revealed what causes something to work, but I think you need to have planned it from the beginning. The thing that immediately comes to mind, of course, is the whole Star Wars midichlorians. Those are just tacked on because they felt for some reason like they needed an explanation for the Force after all these years, even though, it's built up almost as a character in its own right, and there's, you don't need to have an explanation for everything. But if you do decide to have an explanation for it, I think you need to either have it planned from the beginning, or you better be really careful if you're planning it later on that it really fits in with everything that has happened and makes sense and doesn't just feel like it's tacked on.
I would love to tie George Lucas to a chair and grab my soldering iron and just sit down in front of him and ask him, why did you do the midichlorian bullshit? And meanwhile, I'm just soldering like a circuit board. I'm not actually torturing or anything. I have projects to work on while he's tied to a chair.
It's just the implication.
Right. It's the implication. He's got a soldering iron. But really, I need to finish this custom battery pack for my electric bicycle. But they could have very easily just had Qui-Gon be like, oh, I'm getting some Force sense. That boy's special. But no, they had to fucking test his blood with a stupid-looking tricorder thing, and midichlorians now. Mm-hmm. Now they exist. Now it's real.
Do you think they're going to make Rey do a blood test like that?
I hope so, because if they're going to go with midichlorians, they got to double down. They got to stick with it.
Especially when in A New Hope, where Vader is following Luke as Luke is making the bombing run. Vader just says, the Force is strong with this one. He's able to feel it the distance of ships. Mm-hmm. And even earlier in the movie, when...
Vader can sense Leia, too, out there, light years away.
When Obi-Wan gets on the on the Star Destroyer, he's like, that's a presence I haven't felt since... So he knows exactly who's on this ship.
Yep.
At that point, and they're hundreds of meters apart.
Now, my guess is that every Star Destroyer has, in the atmospheric sensors and scrubbers, a midichlorian scanner filter. And that midichlorian scanner filter, much like your air conditioner filter, had just been replaced by a tech. And the first sign of Obi-Wan's midichlorians sifting through it, Vader's got like a little HUD in his helmet, right? And he saw midichlorians matching Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's what it sounds like in his helmet. It talks to him like that. And therefore he was able to know. Yeah.
Man, I sure do.
You better be careful. Like
Star Wars.
George Lucas is going to hire you as a writer. So
No, wait, that's fine. That's fine.
George Lucas no longer has the rights.
Oh my god, can you imagine if they hired me? I'd be like a double agent. I'd be working for Star Wars, but secretly undermining it, and then like feeding all that shit to like the Trek writers to be like, hey, don't do it.
KD would just murder you. like in your sleep.
I'd be out at Skywalker Ranch. Security there is tight. I have a feeling that KD would just go become a Trek writer and do the opposite. Then it's like some spy versus spy shit.
He would write the next Star Trek movie.
yeah.
oh god.
Make it even more Star Wars. Just to spite you.
Okay, what is with the homogenization of like our favorite sci-fi properties? Like, why does everything have to be this action spectacle with callbacks to like present day things that are just ham-handed? What's with that?
Because
it
people
makes
like
money.
Explosions.
Capitalism, Kyle.
Different words, same answer.
Late stage capitalism has ruined science fiction.
I want to talk now kind of about what the most, like, whenever you're designing a system, whenever you're running a system, you got to decide what's the most distinctive things about the setting, what you're going to focus on as a game master whenever your players are interacting with the world. And KP, with our current Eclipse phase game, which unfortunately we are not able to record, because recording a transhuman game where people talk very little to each other, it's all done in text, is not very good for a podcast. But in that game, you are constantly reminding us just some of the most important things about the system, or not the system, but the setting. Everywhere we go, we are just seeing a very wide variety of morphs walking around. Morphs being the biological and mechanically engineered bodies that people inhabit in this future. And you're constantly talking about the ubiquity of the mesh, which is the equivalent of the internet, and making it a big deal when we actually go somewhere that it is not. And I feel like you're doing an awesome job of really hitting those points home to reinforce at every opportunity the setting for us as the players.
Thank you. Those are some of the biggest things that I read out of Eclipse Phase when looking at it. And I think that is a really great point. Whether you're designing a system, a setting, or even working within an existing one. And I've done a little bit of a hybrid with Eclipse Phase. Mostly I've used what's in the book, but I've thrown a few things in or taken a few things out at my discretion. But it's important to digest and kind of break down your setting or your game. And I think it... Okay, debate me on this. I think it might be especially important in a sci-fi game. If you're trying to have a coherent sci-fi verse where things seem to make sense, and if you research hard enough, you're gonna find an explanation for just about anything you want, theoretically. It's important to have kind of the answers for a lot of stuff, whereas in a fantasy setting, it is important to have some things be very mysterious, and you're never going to explain them, and there's always going to be that sense of wonder.
I feel like just in any setting, there always needs to be a sense of wonder. I feel like if you know everything and you can logic everything, then it's not going to be fun. But that's my personal...
Not that you know it, that you can find it if you look hard enough.
Science, the core of science is the unknowable is knowable. And in sci-fi, while as players you may not know everything, it is incumbent on the game master to at least give the illusion of, yes, everything does make sense, even if you can't see the whole picture. And your characters probably will never see the whole picture because you don't have the galaxy eye view of everything that's going on.
That's what I was thinking, is like, you won't see the whole picture, and you might get explanations, but I don't know if they necessarily have to make sense to the average person, because, we're sitting here around this table now, and I'm sure there's tons of scientific crap that, like, some of, like, anything astronomy to me, just, I tried to take a online course about the math that goes into it at one point, and I just fell apart. I couldn't do it. It was just, I just couldn't wrap my brain around it. So, I mean, you might have the sense, sorry.
No, I keep cutting you off, I'm so sorry.
Like, you might have the sense that the answers might be available, but maybe they're not really accessible to each person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that parallels our modern world. Who really knows exactly how our cell phones work?
Right.
But we all know how we can get stuff on them. Most of us sitting here at the table know how to get it to function.
Right.
We may not know how it works. That's kind of the illusion, like what I was referring to. The game master have to give the illusion of knowing how everything functions.
The illusion of competency.
Yeah. And that if the player characters want to delve deeper into it, there is an explanation. Maybe the game master can't come up with it right there at the moment, or maybe it's buried in some book, but the answer is there if you're going to look hard enough for it.
That's one of the things I think is really key. It might not be like mystery in the sense that you think of it, but if you're going to create a world, I feel like having some element of thing that you don't know is very interesting, and I would say it's important when creating your world, because that way it gives your players or your readers or your viewers some sort of something that they want to keep learning about this world, something that keeps them interested. And it doesn't have to be like, why do we life? It could literally just be like, oh, well, how does that thing work? And realizing how the players or the characters realize that through. I think that's really important. Having some aspect or element of, yeah, you know this, but you don't know all the specifics, and therefore it makes you want to learn more.
And I think Eclipse Phase has that, if I'm correct, with the Titans, because people really don't know. There's a ton of crap that's like not known about them and why they came and everything that they did, if they're ever coming back. So I think I do agree with you, Hayley, that even in sci-fi, there's like a really good place for. I mean, there still should be the idea that if you went far enough and long enough, you could figure it out. There's the possibility that it might be figured out at some point. And I think you, as the game master, even if the players might never necessarily figure it out, I think you probably, the game master should have it figured out. So that all of the details that come out about the mystery all actually fit together and make sense if they ever do put it together.
I think that you just explained really the heart of sci-fi versus fantasy role-playing, is that in fantasy, no matter how hard you try, you're never going to meet Helm, a deity, in a D&D setting, unless Helm wants to meet you, or whatever. Like there are things that you could be beating your head against a wall, have all the riches, everything, all the power, knowledge, doesn't really matter. Like, no matter how hard you try, you're never going to do this thing unless this thing wants to reveal itself. Because these things have these supernatural powers or forces behind them. Whereas even in Eclipse Phase, where, yes, you're right, there's actually a small spoilers section in the DM guide for Eclipse Phase that talks about some of the motivations behind the Titans and explanations for why things happened. But even that spoilers guide is very much like, hey, these are just some kind of, they're more like guidelines, really. And this is the big mystery of Eclipse Phase. But in that setting, even though there really is no absolute, hardcore, concrete answer to why the Titans did what they did, Titans being these artificial intelligences that destroyed humanity, or just about. In the universe, there's always that feeling where, hey, if you amass enough wealth, acquire enough knowledge, find the right people, travel through the right Pandora gate, there's a very good chance that you might go insane in the process, but you could meet the Titans and trap one and figure out why they did what they did. And we kind of touched on that in our first fantasy podcast session that kind of turned into fantasy versus sci-fi a little bit. There's always that feeling where if you work hard enough, you can achieve whatever you want to achieve. Butterfly in the sky, I can fly twice as high. But with fantasy, there is that element of, there are some things that are just external to you, forces at work here that are fantastic and beyond your understanding.
In fantasy, magic is the end of an explanation. In sci-fi, it's the beginning. Or the beginning of an investigation into what is going on.
And you can tell me this kind of goes off track, but one of the things, like, I wasn't here for the initial fantasy versus sci-fi discussion, and one of my feelings about either sci-fi / fantasy or even pure fantasy is that if it's going to be good fantasy, the rules that you make up should at least be internally consistent. And if you break those, and a lot of times, you know, those internally consistent rules are broken for some reason. Like, you decide that magic works a certain way in this universe, but this big boss that people are going to go up against is going to have found some way to, like, supersede that and has, like, a much better, you know, has, like, is a lot more powerful because of that. Mm-hmm. I think if you're going to break the rules, like, it still needs to be foreshadowed correctly. There needs to be a reason why they're able to break those rules, as opposed to, especially in a game, your characters are going along and they've determined the internal rules to be thus, and all of a sudden, with no, you know, lead up to it, you throw them something that's completely different. It can kind of feel, I would think, like it's not, like, unfairness.
So you're saying that it is unfair in, like, the final fantasy encounter to fight a boss, and then after you get done fighting the boss, it transforms into something that is completely different and has completely different powers?
I absolutely felt like that when I was a kid. I absolutely felt like that was unfair.
Y'all referencing Final Fantasy games or what? That happens all the damn time.
Yeah. I absolutely felt that was unfair when I was a kid. And would have felt, I mean, I loved Final Fantasy and still do, actually, but I feel the really good fantasy that I've read or played still has reasons. I still feel like you don't have to explain everything, but whatever you've come up with in your head should at least be internally consistent so that people can kind of learn, you know, the rules of the game as they go.
Beth, you just touched on something that I think is a good tool maybe for game masters to use when running a sci-fi game. The lead up to this conversation right now, we've been talking about how for sci-fi, you're going to want to have things maybe make a little more sense and have explanations for everything. And that sounds like really daunting. That sounds probably terrifying. And I don't want to discourage anybody from running a sci-fi game. Quite the opposite, in fact. I want to encourage people to, you know, dip their toes into sci-fi. I'm not saying that you need to have everything figured out and have an explanation for everything. And if a player asks, how does the charge pack on this plasma rifle work? You don't have to have a 5-minute scientific or pseudoscience even explanation for how that charge pack works. You don't need to know all of that. But what you just said is very true, I think. Don't make something happen, or don't create an object, or don't throw in an element or any element of your game. Don't put it in there just because you feel like it. Have a reason for having the boss have a second mode that it transforms into. Mm-hmm. Have a reason for this character to be able to break the rules. Be they this is just kind of general GM advice, be they magic or otherwise. And so in your sci-fi game, though, have a reason why that object is important, or how it interconnects with everything else. So if somebody asks, how does the charge pack on this plasma pistol work? You could say to them, that charge pack is a standard unit used to power many different small to medium-sized devices around this solar empire. And that tells them, oh, cool, so I have a weapon here, that's great and all, but if I get in a jam, I need to power up a console to make a radio transmission, I could probably use the power pack from my plasma pistol. Mm-hmm. They don't have to know how the reaction inside works and how the circuits are wired. You don't need to draw out a fucking circuit diagram for everything. but that is an example of how that connects and how that lets your players feel more immersed in the world.
And I'm glad you brought up that specific example, because previously we had been talking very macro. And that's a very micro aspect of the world that that really should not be neglected at all. Whenever you're playing a game, whenever you're presenting a game, and even the players themselves can participate in this. You have to define what is normal for the setting. What is possible for just not necessarily the typical person, but the typical player character. Because in most settings, the player characters are a little cut above. But you need to define what is normal in the world. What are everyday interactions? What do you eat? How do you get around? What are your living conditions? When I think back about good sci-fi, they always highlight that. My God, Blade Runner does such an awesome job of all three of those conditions in the first 5 minutes of the movie. The Fifth Element in the first, maybe not 5 minutes, but definitely in the first 15 minutes of the movie. You're seeing Bruce Willis go through a day in his life. And that's how you ground the player characters. That's how you ground the story, is show them how people eat, what types of food are available. Is it some street vendor on a grimy street in the rain dealing out Chinese food, or is it a flying kiosk flying around to individual apartments and dispensing Chinese food?
Which, as much as I love The Fifth Element, I was just about to say, Clayton, that is one of the areas where it almost cracked my suspension of disbelief. Because this dude has a fucking flying, junk. It's like a Chinese junk, which is a type of sailing ship. But there's no sails on it, no. It's got rocket thrusters. And it flies from apartment to apartment, individually giving you Chinese food. Can you and he chats with you. He stays there and makes your food. Can you think about the, impracticality of that? That lo mein, or whatever it is that Bruce Willis eats, must cost a lot of money.
That's what I was just thinking. What your price would have to be to, make up for all that overhead.
I said almost, though. I still love that film. And I believe that would be fine. I would order Chinese food if it flew up to my house.
A quote that I've heard years ago, but I have no idea who originally said it. We are the most critical of the things that we love. And that is so incredibly true for geeks. It is the entire reason why we're doing this podcast. And yeah, KP and I may bitch a lot about sci-fi, but I'll tell you what, with the exception of Jordan, who is not here, we're the three people I know who love sci-fi more than pretty much anyone I've ever met.
Yeah. Clayton has sat, on the couch and watched all of Star Trek through, close to twice by now, I think. Probably more times than I'm aware of. And every time I walk in the room, he's got something to tell me about how stupid it is.
I really would love to have a discussion, maybe even on a podcast session, but maybe not, where, Kyle Driscoll and I sit down and debate what we, fight against our loves. He'll explain why Star Wars is bad, and I'll explain why Star Trek is bad. I don't mean bad overall, but I mean, just like you said, we are most critical of the things we love. That's why I'm never critical about myself.
Saddest thing ever.
Well, guys, what do you say we quit this bullshit? Start rolling some dice.
By bullshit, do you mean this miserable life?
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons Attribution No Derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.